Now, Harry, with the Old Testament, of course, we're talking about a corpus of writings that evolved over 1,000 years. With the New Testament, you've got a nice, compact little collection of writings. Did people immediately realize that these were the Word of God and nothing else was?
No.
Or how did this go?
No, obviously it didn't take quite as long to get the New Testament together as it took to get the Old, but it did take some time. And the process begins with actually the earliest written materials that we have in the New Testament are letters of Paul. And Paul's letters were not meant to be canonical scripture. They were meant to solve individual particular pastoral problems in the congregations that he was dealing with. But sometime, probably shortly after his death, they were pulled together in some sort of compilation. We don't know exactly when, but sometime in the last quarter of the first century, I suspect.
Now, did they have any handwriting experts checking as to whether these actually were letters of Paul?
No, and some of them were probably written by his disciples.
Yes.
On the grounds of style and literary form, we can pretty well determine that some of them are definitely non-Pauline, and then some of them articulate positions that Paul would never have taken. They stand in tension with the main Pauline texts.
Okay, so you've got a little expansion there already.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what's striking, of course, about the letters of Paul is how little is in them about Jesus' career before his crucifixion, let's say.
Very little in them about Jesus. So we have another tradition developing during the same time as Paul is writing his letters.
Yeah.
First of all, it begins as an oral tradition, the sayings of Jesus, his parables and stories about him. Were transmitted. There were probably also little formulas, in the same way as you were talking about the core of the Hebrew Bible being a law collection that goes back a good ways in the history of Israel. So there were confessional statements that Christians made about the death and resurrection of Jesus, for instance, the sort of thing that Paul cites in 1 Corinthians 15. And that confessional creed was a kind of core of what comes to be the Jesus story. And it gets expanded alongside of the traditions about his teaching and then amalgamated in several stages. The Gospels
when did this
to begin
first get put into a continuous story?
Probably with the Gospel of Mark. And one way of characterizing the Gospel of Mark, written around 70, is that it's a passion narrative, a story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, with a lengthy introduction. Yeah. And the lengthy introduction has stories about his activity as a miracle worker, a little bit about his teaching. And just as in the case of the prophets, as you were saying that there was a development and an expansion, so too there's a development and an expansion of the gospel story, according to Mark, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And
now, when Mark wrote his gospel, was there any other material out there?
Well, apart from the Pauline letters.
Yeah, any material about Jesus?
Probably so. There was probably a written collection of his teachings. We think that both Matthew and Luke drew upon such a written collection, at least some people do. Yeah. There's a lot of overlap in the stories that they tell about what Jesus told and the sayings that are attributed to him. And scholars tend to refer to this as Q, from the German word Quelle, or source. And so a source of teachings of Jesus that gets amalgamated with the framework of Mark separately in both Matthew and Luke. So that's out there.
But of course, we don't have that as a separate document anymore.
We have to reconstruct it from Matthew and Luke.
So now Matthew and Luke read Mark's gospel, presumably. What didn't they like about it? What was it that led them to say this won't do? We can do better.
I think both of them had judgments about Mark that were, in some cases, literary. They didn't like his Greek. It was a little sloppy and not elegant. Both of them write better Greek. Both of them think, I believe, that the story of Jesus is incomplete. If you're going to write a story about Jesus, you ought to do it in good biographical form and say something about his origin, as well as just when he comes onto the public scene, as Mark does. So both of them have birth narratives. And then Mark is incomplete because although it reports an empty tomb, it doesn't say anything about the appearances of the resurrected one. And both Matthew and Luke have different versions about that. So they have a fuller, more complete story and much more teaching. Mark is almost all about action, 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 with a little bit of teaching. And Matthew and Luke want to have more of that.
Now, this problem of having different gospels reminds me that in the Old Testament you have different collections of laws that often go over the same ground. and correct something or change it that was in one of the earlier ones? And there has been a debate there, did they intend to replace the older one, or did they just mean to supplement it? What do you think was the case with the Gospels? Do you think, did Matthew think that people should still be buying Mark?
It's interesting to think of it in those terms of displacing Gospels or displacing books that are on the market. My hunch is that all of these Gospels had a community that stood behind them and for which they were particularly meaningful. And I'm not quite sure where the Markan community was. I think the Matthean community probably was in Antioch for a variety of reasons associated with the figure of Matthew and Peter. And I think the Lucan community was probably someplace in Asia Minor, maybe Ephesus, sort of the environment where Paul was very prominent. So each of these Gospels had their factions, their enthusiasts in different parts of the world, and they weren't going to give up their Gospel. So if Mark, for instance, were in Scythopolis or something, they would hold on to it.
How then did they get over that problem?
By putting them all together. Well, there were different answers to that question. Let me go back to the displacement question, because there's one other Gospel that we haven't mentioned, and that's John. And there's a lot of debate about exactly when it was written. My own theory on the matter is that John was written sometime around the end of the first century, and that it knew the other Gospels. And in addition to, or rather than supplementing them, it did want to displace them. It did want to do a much better job of what a gospel should, in the eyes of that evangelist, do, which is to facilitate an encounter with the resurrected Christ. And it does so by a dramatic narrative. So I think John did mean to not to supplement, but to supplant the others. There were two ways of dealing with this multiplicity of gospels, and that's what happens in the second century. One is, and there are other Gospels out there too.
Well, yeah,
that's clear. We have the four ones that eventually became canonical, but there are other fragments of Gospels, and there are later reports about Gospels. Some of them in Jewish Christian circles, for instance, that probably would have had a story of a more law-observant Jesus. Don't know. But in any case, there were different Gospels circulating in the second century. What do? One thing is to try to amalgamate them into one. And so you have an experiment by a guy named Tatian, who does something called the diatessaron, the one out of four. And what he does is to create a gospel harmony. And he picks and chooses from the various gospels and combines them into one smooth story. Another is to canonize a bunch of them and then have a rationale for doing so. Canonize or describe as authoritative, I guess would be the better way to describe it.
Accept
as authoritative.
Authorize. That's or something.
And you have that strategy exemplified in Irenaeus, who was a heresiologist writing in France, in Lyon, around 180. And he says, we have four Gospels because we have four cardinal points on the compass and we have four leaves in the clover. You know, various,
as you just mentioned in passing, we actually had more than four Gospels.
That's right.
How about some of the ones that got left out?
Well, some of the ones that got left out were accepted as pious reading in the church, things like the infancy Gospel of Thomas or the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is more about the youth of the mother of Jesus.
And very entertaining.
Very entertaining, yeah. So they were popular literature, and they survive in multiple copies, multiple languages throughout the Christian world. So they were read, but they weren't recognized as stuff to be read in the liturgy. Okay? Some things were discovered more recently, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, both of them surviving in Coptic, Gospel of Mary discovered in the 19th century, etc. So these things are discovered, or have been discovered fairly frequently over the course of the last 200 years.
Yeah. Now, actually, when our sons were in high school, we heard a report that more Americans could name the four Beatles than could name the four Gospels. So we tested our sons, and our son Aidan said, I can name the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. And we were rather proud of him because, I mean, at least he had heard about the Gospel of Thomas. But now, what was it? Some people actually think that was very early.
That's right. Dating the Gospel of Thomas is a matter of controversy. It was discovered as a whole as part of a collection of Coptic texts that was unearthed in 1946 at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And it consists of 114 sayings of Jesus, no stories about him, no birth narratives, no, not much in the way of miracle stories, and no resurrection stuff. So it's all sayings of Jesus, sort of the little red book of Jesus. And it's circulated, we know, in Egypt, and not simply in Coptic circles, but also in Greek, because we had 3 Greek fragments of this text that were discovered at the end of the 19th century. We didn't know where they were from until the Coptic text was discovered. So we know it was a popular collection of sayings material, rather like the book of Proverbs, perhaps, something that was used for educational purposes in certain Christian circles.
But now, in the last few years, well, say over, if you broaden it a little bit, 40, 45 years, we've had a series of previously unknown Gospels come to light. The first one I'm thinking of was the Secret Gospel of Mark, published by a man named Morton Smith, and then more recently we had the Gospel of Judas, and most recently of all, the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Now, why would any church authorities not include the Gospel of Jesus' wife if you're making a collection?
Right.
What
well,
do they have against her?
I'll talk about the Gospel of Jesus' wife in a bit, but I want to go back for a minute to the issue of church authorities doing what they do, because we have an example of that from the 2nd century. By the 2nd century, you have Gospels being recognized as authoritative, and some people like Irenaeus saying there only should be 4, right? We have a story reported by Eusebius, the church father of the 4th century, about a bishop of Antioch named Serapion at the end of the 2nd century. And he was presented with a text, the Gospel of Peter, and asked if it could be used in Christian liturgy. And he said, sure, by all means. And then he read the text. And when he read the text, he said, no, this won't do, because it has Jesus just appearing to be real and not fully incarnate, and that's not orthodox. We know what we believe, and so get rid of that. So there were people in authority making judgments about what texts conformed to what they understood to be the Christian message, certainly by the end of the 2nd century. The Gospels that you just mentioned, the Secret Gospel of Mark was discovered by a guy named Morton Smith, professor at Columbia University. What he discovered was a copy of a letter by Clement of Alexandria, a 2nd century church father, that quotes a gospel that's in circulation in Alexandria in his day that seems to be a Gospel of Mark, but it has extra material in it. According to Smith's reconstruction of this letter, and what the letter basically says is that there were 2 or 3 versions of the Gospel of Mark in circulation. One, the one that we have, the canonical Mark, one, a secret Mark that has these interpolations, and then a yet more secret Mark that has further interpolations that are serving the needs of a particular heretical sect. And he said the middle one is okay, the last one is not. All right? There were all sorts of questions about Morton Smith's discovery, and some people suspect that he might actually have forged the letter. A lot of people don't believe that and think that it's correct. If it's a valid letter of Clement of Alexandria, what it shows is what all the other information that we've just been talking about confirms. That is, that there were a number of Gospels in circulation in early Christian circles, and they were supplemented and reused and developed by different Christian groups. So no surprise there.
But in any case, what comes up from this is that at some point, church authorities made a decision as to what would be in and what would be out. By when was that settled?
Okay. Not fully settled until the 4th century. And there were debates between Eastern and Western Christians about things like the Epistle to the Hebrews and the Book of Revelation and whether they should be in. By the 4th century, most Christian leaders said, yeah, we'll accept both. And the first description of what we know as the canonical New Testament comes from a letter of Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria in 367, where he lists our canonical New Testament and says, this is what it is, this is what you should read.
So at least the New Testament got settled a little bit earlier than the Old Testament.
A little bit earlier, right.
But there's still an awful lot of good stuff out there on the fringes that is worth a look to.
Indeed.